In this lecture, we're going to look at just the anatomy parts of the respiratory system. So kind of just start off, yes, some basic prefixes, root words you're going to see throughout this entire PowerPoint, and some we're going to look at in this particular lecture. So looking at the respiratory system, yes, the major function of the respiratory system is respiration, which means we need to supply the entire body with oxygen for cellular respiration to take place. When one of the waste products of cellular respiration is carbon dioxide, so we need a way to get rid of the carbon dioxide in the body. Now, the respiratory system has four main processes, and they involve both respiratory and circulatory systems, which we'll look at in the next slide. The respiratory system also has some functions in olfaction, which is smelling, and in speech, and we'll talk about those as well today. Now, those four main processes for the respiratory system, the first two both have to do with the respiratory system itself. The second two have more to do with the circulatory system, but these two aren't going to happen. Number 3 and 4 aren't going to happen if number 1 and 2 don't happen. So with respiration, we have pulmonary respiration, and pulmon has anything to do with the lungs. So this is the actual breathing, getting air in and out of the lungs. External respiration, again, this, this is respiration, which anytime you hear the word respiration, just means gas exchange. External respiration, which means there's an oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange between the lungs and the blood. So the fact we just brought air into the lungs means we're bringing this oxygen from the lungs and getting into the blood. It also means carbon dioxide that was in the blood now gets dumped into the lungs from breathing out of the body. So it's getting that oxygen and carbon dioxide, from that pulmonary ventilation part, either into the blood or out of the blood. Once we have oxygen in the blood, we need to transport it around. Now, same thing, carbon dioxide that's in the blood needs to get transported throughout the body to eventually end up in the lungs. That transport function is more of a function of the circulatory system, of the blood, and the blood moving around and moving to the lungs. And then we have internal respiration. So external respiration was exchanging of gases between lungs and blood. Internal respiration is exchanging of gases, that oxygen and carbon dioxide, from the blood to the actual tissues itself, from where we're actually dropping off that oxygen in the body versus where we're picking up carbon dioxide in the body. It has nothing to do with the lungs. Since the lungs leads to outside, that's the external. Internal, this is happening in the tissue level. Now, the basic major organs that we're going to look at that are all part of the respiratory system, we're going to start our way at the top of the respiratory system with the nose, nasal cavity, and the sinuses, and work our way down to the lungs and the alveoli. So we're going to just work on a top-down method. Some other just basic functional and anatomy terms. One, we've got something known as a respiratory zone and a conducting zone. Anytime we have anything that's in a respiratory zone, again, respiration means exchanging of gases, so a respiratory zone is where gas exchange takes place. These are in the tiniest little areas of the respiratory system, such as respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and the alveoli. The conducting zone just means we are transporting air. We're transporting gas from one place to the next, so they're just conduits of gas exchange sites. So it's getting the air or the gases, to or from those respiratory zones. It includes all the other respiratory structures that help clean the air, warm the air, humidify the air, so that by the time, that air that was outside the body is now inside the body. It's kind of a nice, warm, tropical air. Now, the diaphragm and the respiratory muscles do help with ventilation. However, they are muscles that are actually part of the muscular system. Although they do aid in respiration, they're part of the muscular system. Now we're going to start with our pathway of air from outside of the body in. And yes, you should know the pathway of air. What organ comes first, comes next, and what is the passageway of air. So starting at the top with the nose, this is the only external part of the respiratory system. You can't see anything else of the respiratory system except the nose. Its major functions: provide an airway for respiration. It helps moisten and warm the air. It filters and helps clean the air. And part of it is because we do have some ciliated membranes inside the nose for helping clean the air. It also serves as a resonating chamber for speech. You probably all, especially as a kid, held your nose and talked and thought it was the funniest thing ever because your voice, the sound that comes out of your mouth changes a little bit if you plug your nose. It also houses the olfactory receptors. These are used for smell. Now inside the nasal cavity, so behind that external nares, inside the nasal cavity, we have olfactory mucosa. There are two types of mucosa in our nasal cavity. The olfactory mucosa is found in the top part of the nasal cavity. This is where you have your smell receptors. So it contains the olfactory mucosa, contains olfactory epithelium, where you have all your little smell receptors. So at the very top of the nasal cavity. The rest of the nasal cavity, so the majority of it, is all lined with something known as a respiratory mucosa. It's a pseudostratified, ciliated columnar epithelium, which is also something you had to know in lab. There's mucus and serous secretions that contain lysozyme and defensins. Now, we make about 1 liter of these secretions in our nose every single day. Their main job is to trap and kill bacteria and any other debris that enters into our nasal passageway. Yes, eventually, they go down the respiratory system and we ended up swallowing them. The cilia that we find inside there, their job is to move contaminated mucus to the back of the throat to be swallowed and digested. Any air that we breathe in is warmed by all the capillaries and veins, the blood supply inside the nose. And we also have sensory nerve endings that trigger sneezing. So which is just forcing air out of the respiratory system in a big, huge, violent burst. This could be any type of irritant like dust or pollen, things like that. Now the paranasal sinuses. These are the sinuses that we learned way back when we did in lab when we did the skeletal system. It's those empty cavities inside the head. Those are sinuses that have to do with the respiratory system. You find it in the frontal bone, the sphenoid, ethmoid, and maxillary bones. Their job, it lightens the skull because you have a big open area. They also help inside of it secrete mucus, which helps warm and moisten air. And I'm like, when you blow your nose, you are draining some of the fluid that's inside the sinuses. Now, some problems that can happen with the nose is if you have any type of inflammation of your nasal mucosa. So any of those, the 2 linings that you find inside that nasal cavity, it's known as rhinitis. Rhine means nose, so it's an inflammation of the nose. The nasal mucosa is continuous with mucosa of the rest of the respiratory tract. So generally, if you have an inflammation due to something in your nose, it usually spreads from the nose to the throat to the chest. So people that have upper respiratory infections usually end up with a lower respiratory infection. Now, the mucosa also spreads to our tear ducts and paranasal sinuses. Now, if you get an inflammation of those paranasal sinuses, they become blocked, and I'm like, they can't drain their fluids. Air ends up being absorbed into those openings, which creates a vacuum, and you may have experienced what's known as a sinus headache before. Like, it's usually, again, you've got some type of cold, some type of inflammation in your nose, which ends up causing that sinus headache. Now, moving our way down, so we are up in the nose in this nasal cavity region. Now we're going to move to the back region. This is known as the pharynx. It's all composed of a skeletal muscle. It's a tube that's about 5 inches long. And there are 3 different regions that we'll start at the top, but again, working our way down. We've got the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx, all named for where they are. So the nasopharynx is this red region, again, because it's behind the nasal passageway. In this nasopharynx, it's lined with a pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Right below it, kind of right inside of it, we have the soft palate and the uvula hanging down that close the nasopharynx during swallowing. And when you think about it, it's like, why would you want that to happen? Well, if you're swallowing food or beverages, when we swallow, this closes so that food and beverage doesn't go up into the nasal passageway that you could, in theory, eat upside down or drink upside down. Also found in this nasopharynx region, we have the pharyngeal tonsils way up here at the top. Kind of looks like the white little bulgy stuff. It's also called the adenoids. Now, people that have swollen adenoids or pharyngeal tonsils, it can lead to snoring. So a lot of people, I'm like, if their snoring is bad enough, can actually have these removed. We also find a little passageway right here is the pharyngotympanic tube, also known as the auditory tube, also known as the eustachian tube. This drains and equalizes pressure from the middle ear. So the ear actually drains down into the nasal passageway, or the back of the nasal passageway into the nasopharynx. It opens up into the lateral wall, so on either side of the wall in this nasopharynx region, you're going to find an auditory tube from each ear. Now the oropharynx, further down, named, anything OR has to do with mouth, so this is the region behind the mouth. Now, once we've gotten to this region, we now have a passageway for both food and air. Anything from that soft palate, all the way down. This goes from the soft palate to epiglottis, but anything going further down here, anywhere in the pharynx, we've got passageway for food and air. Because now food can go into this particular area, it's now lined with stratified squamous epithelium. And if you remember way back when we talked about different types of tissues, stratified means multiple layered. Squamous is kind of that scale or regular shape. And I'm like, places you find stratified squamous, places where they're in the body are places where you have high abrasion. Just like your skin is made up of stratified squamous. I'm like, we can swallow things we don't chew well enough. And I'm like, all of that. And I'm like, once we now have food and drinks, maybe it's an acidic drink or too hot of a beverage that you've swallowed. So now we want more of a protective lining. If you remember back in that nasopharynx, we had that pseudostratified columnar epithelium, not meant for abrasion. Other things we find in the oropharynx, one are the palatine tonsils. So here is the hard palate. Again, review from lab, hard palate, soft palate. Right below that are your palatine tonsils on either side of that oropharynx. We also have the lingual tonsil. Ling means tongue. So at the back side of the tongue, you're going to find that lingual tonsil. The laryngopharynx, again, working our way down. We have both food and air, so it's lined with stratified squamous epithelium. It's posterior to the epiglottis. Here's the epiglottis right here. It's right behind that and works its way down. It goes all the way down to the esophagus or trachea, depending whether it's going to divide. Or it extends to the larynx before it divides. And then it's continuous with the esophagus. Now, the esophagus is there, it conducts food and liquids, and I'm like, the air is what gets divided and goes into the larynx. So you're going to have food kind of dividing in this particular region once we get into that larynx region, which should only be air. But in the laryngopharynx, you might have food that will get shuttled down to the esophagus. You might have air that's going to get shuttled into the larynx itself. So that larynx, if the laryngopharynx does its job well enough, it will shuttle food with the help of the epiglottis into the actual larynx part. Now the larynx is attached to the hyoid bone, little U-shaped bone. It opens into the laryngopharynx. It's continuous with the trachea. It's just a tiny little section. It's pretty small. I was going to say, its main job, it just provides an open or patent airway, and it helps with the laryngopharynx route air and food into their proper channels. They can switch back and forth, putting air into the further past the larynx and food down into the esophagus. Also, it's one of its biggest jobs. It's in voice production because it's the vocal folds that you're going to find inside the larynx. Now, there are 9 different cartilages that make up the larynx. You're only going to have to know a couple of them, and I've got them bolded. Now, all of this cartilage is a hyaline cartilage, except the epiglottis. The epiglottis is going to be an elastic cartilage. Everything else is hyaline, the eyeball soup cartilage. The thyroid cartilage, this big, huge part right in the middle, at the very front of it, where it kind of bulges out, is a little spike. That's known as the laryngeal prominence, also nicknamed as the Adam's apple. Now, this laryngeal prominence is thicker and larger in males because sex hormones such as testosterone just stimulates its growth during puberty. It also causes the voice to change when this gets larger during puberty. Below that are ring-shaped cartilages. called cricoid cartilage. And then the other cartilage I have to know is just that elastic cartilage, the epiglottis. It covers the laryngeal inlet during swallowing, so food doesn't get past that epiglottis. Now, inside the larynx, if we're going to look down on it, we're going to be able to see the vocal folds. So, Mike, the vocal folds or the vocal ligaments are these white structured. They can contain elastic fibers so they can be stretched. Right in between it, the little opening is known as the glottis. So the glottis is the opening. It's closed here, open over here. And we can vibrate these particular white vocal folds to produce sound as the air rushes up from our lungs. The faster they vibrate, the higher the pitch. When males hit puberty, their vocal folds start to get longer and thicker, which is going to give them a deeper voice. Now, Mike, if you want, a higher pitched voice, like many females have, they're going to have shorter, usually higher tension. We can kind of pull and stretch those vocal folds a little bit higher. It's going to lead to a higher pitched. Now, on either side of the vocal folds, or vocal cords, whichever you want to call it, these are also called true vocal cords. We also have on the sides what are known as vestibular folds. They have nothing to do with the actual sound itself. They just help close the glottis during swallowing so that air doesn't get through. Mike, so you have true vocal folds that we can stretch and vibrate, and on either side you have the vestibular folds, nicknamed false vocal cords, that just help close that glottis. Now, with voice production, so speech, the fact that you're listening to me right now is because I am releasing air and I'm opening and closing the glottis at intermittent time periods. Now, the pitch of my voice, whether it's high-pitched or low-pitched, is determined by the length and tension of your vocal cords. If you increase the tension, if I stretch those vocal folds, or if I make them shorter, I'm going to have a higher pitched voice. So Mike, it'll be kind of the high-pitched voice, versus if I have, really long, kind of, say, longer, thicker, because I don't have a lot of tension on those vocal folds, I'll have a deeper voice. So length and tension determines pitch. How loud I talk, whether I'm being really, really quiet or if I'm really, really loud, depends on the force of the air. How much air am I pushing past those vocal folds? Now, other things that help change your, the voice production, you have chambers that air can go through in the pharynx, the mouth, the nasal area, and the sinus cavities that all amplify and enhance sound quality. So if you have any type of infection in your nose, in your pharynx, in your sinus regions, in your mouth, your voice changes. That's why, like, if you've got a cold, your voice sounds different. Now, sound, the actual sound, is shaped into language by muscles of the pharynx, the tongue, the soft palate, the back of your throat, and your lips, so that you can make the L sound and the R sound and all of these other different letter sounds. Now, the epithelium that we find in the larynx, and I'm like, it is made up of stratified squamous epithelium, at least the top part is, because you might still have food that's getting shuttled to the correct place. Anything below those vocal folds is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. It's a mouthful to say. It has the cilia. Its main job, it filters out any dust that might be in the air. It also moves mucus up and out of the respiratory tract and then to be swallowed into the digestive tract. Now, smoking inhibits or destroys the cilia that you would find right here. And without cilia, the only way to prevent mucus from accumulating in the lungs, since the cilia help moves it up and out, is for coughing. And this is why smokers always have the smoker's cough. They've damaged their cilia. The cilia can't move that mucus up and out, so they have to cough. Now, another interesting thing that happens with the larynx, we can actually use our vocal folds, the things that help us create speech, to prevent air passage. And then you think, why would we want to prevent air passage? Well, an example would be something known as the Valsalva's maneuver. Now, what we do in the Valsalva's maneuver, it's a good one to know, hint, hint, We can close the glottis, so no air passageway, no air can leave. If we contract our abdominal muscles, the pressure inside of our abdomen rises. Now, why that's a good thing, one, it helps empty the rectum, so when you're going number 2, you may not even realize you're closing the glottis, you're contracting your abdominal muscles, and you're creating a higher pressure in there to empty that rectum. Kind of holding the breath. Some people grunt a little bit too. It also helps stabilize the trunk during heavy lifting. If you've never even thought about it either, anytime you lift something heavy, it's like you hold your breath. You're holding your breath and contracting your abdominal muscles, creating extra pressure in there that helps stabilize you when you're lifting something heavy. And again, you always have the people that grunt a little bit too while they're doing that too. Now, moving our way down from the larynx. So at this point, we should have only air, that was filtered out or shuttled through the larynx. Now, the trachea wall is composed of 3 different layers. This may also look familiar from lab. You have the mucosa layer. We've got the 3 layers here. We have the mucosa layer. This is where you have your ciliated, you can cilia on top, pseudostratified, because the nucleus look like they're different layers, epithelium with different goblet cells inside of there that are helping make some of the mucus. You have a submucosa layer. This is where you have a connective tissue with seromucous glands. Based on their name, they make mucus. And then underneath that we have the adventitia layer. This is the layer that you're going to find hyaline cartilage, your eyeball soup. It's made up, it makes up C-shaped rings of cartilage. Again, they don't go all the way around in trachea. They're not a perfect circle, but they are C-shaped. Now, this C-shaped cartilage, again, you can see this hyaline cartilage in the blue. Your C-shape doesn't go all the way around. But right behind it, so here's that space of the trachea, you've got that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, the submucosal layer right below that, and your hyaline cartilage. At the back of the trachea, you have something known as the trachealis muscle. It connects the back ends of these cartilage rings, and it contracts during coughing to expel mucus. So when it contracts, it kind of helps loosen any mucus that's inside of there, and it gets coughed up. Now, at the bottom part of the trachea, on the last part, the last little cartilage area at the very, very bottom, you have a little, they call it a spar of cartilage, called a little nubbin. This is, just right where the the brachia branches into 2 main bronchi. It's this carina that if anything other than air hits that carina, it triggers a violent coughing, which this means, if anything has gotten into into that respiratory tract other than air, we don't want it in our lungs. So it's kind of a last-ditch effort to try to get rid of whatever it is if it's not air. Now, zooming in, this is just to show you that, yes, there is cilia in the trachea. So, zoomed in 2,500 times the normal size, but there's some of the cilia that you'd find in your trachea, trying to move mucus out. Now, at the bottom of the trachea, where again we start dividing and going into our lungs, we start branching and going to the lungs, we branch and go into what are known as the bronchi. Now, once we start dividing, the air passages that are dividing undergo 23 orders of branching. So that means one thing, such as the trachea, splits into 2, and then each of those split into 4, and then those 4 split into 8. It's kind of doing the exponential. Each thing is dividing 23 different times. Because we start off with 1 and branch in 23 different orders, we have something known as the bronchial tree or respiratory tree. So if we flip it upside down, it kind of looks like a big trunk of a tree with all the branches and all the little leaves. Now, from the tips of the bronchial tree, we are going to change from conducting zone structures to respiratory zone structures. So we're going to go from just moving air to actual exchanging of gases. All right, but before we get there, so we've got the trachea. It's going to have our first division into what are known as primary bronchi. So each one of these, after the split of the trachea, is known as the primary bronchi. each of these main bronchi is going to enter into the hilum of one lung. So air that's in this primary bronchi, this is all this air that's in here is going to go into, get divided and go into all of this lung, the left lung. Any of the air that's in here is going to go into the right lung. Now the hilum is the little indent into the lung where you're going to find the primary trachea and various blood vessels. Now the right main bronchi is wider, shorter, and more vertical than the left main bronchi. So if food or anything has gotten through everywhere else and ends up being there, this is where you can get foreign objects stuck, as in this right main bronchus. Now each main bronchi then branches, because we're going to branch 23 different times, into secondary bronchus, or bronchi. So this particular primary bronchi branches into 1, 2, 3. 3 different secondary bronchi. It's known as secondary bronchi because these are each branching from the primary bronchus. And your left primary bronchus divides into 2 different secondary bronchi. Now, if you think about it, why 3 on this side? Why 2 on this side? You're like, I don't know, just tell me. Well, it's because your right lung has 3 lobes, so you need 3 different secondary bronchi, and your left lung has 2 lobes, so you need 2 secondary bronchi on that side. Now, each secondary bronchi, whether it's 3 or 2, then branches into what are known as tertiary or segmental bronchi. Now, as we start to branch, these branches start to get smaller and smaller, of course, until we eventually lead into something known as bronchioles. Anytime you put "ole" at the end of something, it just means small. So a bronchiole is like a small bronchi. Once they start to get less than 1 millimeter in diameter, we call them bronchioles. And at the very, very end, where they're really tiny, it's like the tiniest bronchioles. It's like small bronchioles. We call them terminal bronchioles. Again, terminal meaning the end, because the bronchioles have split as well. They're the smallest, and they're less than 0.5 millimeters in diameter. Tiny, microscopic. Now, as we go from bronchi all the way through the bronchioles, various structural changes occur as we start going from large bronchi down to tiny little bronchioles. One, cartilage rings that you would find around these structures start to become irregular plates. In the bronchioles, you have elastic fibers replacing cartilage. The epithelium changes from a pseudostratified columnar to cuboidal, and cilia and goblet cells become sparse. We don't want goblet cells in there because they make mucus, and we don't want mucus in the lungs. We also, since we're going from the pseudostratified columnar to cuboidal, and we don't have cilia trying to remove any debris. If you do end up having debris that gets into the bronchioles, then anything has to get eaten up using macrophages, using our immune system. Now, the amount of smooth muscle, though, however, does increase. This allows us to constrict different areas of the lungs when necessary. Now, we're going to look at the respiratory zone, so where it is in the lungs where we actually have gas exchange taking place. So where gas exchange takes place starts with the terminal bronchioles, which eventually becomes respiratory bronchioles. And the respiratory bronchioles go further down into what are known as alveolar ducts, which are going to lead into these alveolar sacs. Now, alveolar sacs just means they contain clusters of alveoli, and we have approximately 300 million alveoli in each lung. It is in these alveoli where we have, our major gas exchange taking place. And they kind of look like big bunches of grapes. Now, surrounding the alveoli, which again, we've got gas exchange going to take place here, we have something known as the respiratory membrane. Again, anytime you see respiratory anything, it's gas exchange taking place. So our respiratory membrane is where gas exchange is going to take place. You've got the alveolar, part of the respiratory system. So the alveoli, so we have the alveolar and capillary walls. The capillary walls, this has to do with blood. So we've got the lungs, and we've got blood supply right next to each other, both very tiny. So it's these two walls and their fused basement membranes. In fact, we've fused both the alveoli and the blood vessels together. Very, very thin, 0.5 micrometers thick. So micrometer, I'm like, this is like one times 10 to the negative sixth of a meter. Very, very, very thin. I'm like, and you need it thin, and it needs to be thin enough for gases to go across it for them to diffuse. So gas exchange happens across the membrane by simple diffusion. If you remember simple diffusion, stuff always wants to go from high concentration to low. Oxygen wants to go where there's not as much oxygen. Carbon dioxide wants to go where there's not as much carbon dioxide. Also in the respiratory membrane, you have alveolar walls. It's just a single layer of squamous epithelium. So you've got your simple squamous epithelium, and inside of here, you've got some type 1 alveolar cells, found in this layer. Now, scattered throughout these, type 1 alveolar cells, you have some cuboidal type 2 alveolar cells. They secrete something known as surfactant. Highlight it. We're going to come back and talk more about the importance of this, but surfactant coats the gas-exposed alveolar surfaces. Now, why you want to cover these alveolar surfaces it becomes very, very important. The main job, it helps reduce tension. We'll get more into that at a different day. It also makes some microbial proteins for some immunity at this particular level of the respiratory system. Now this is showing you these alveolar sacs with all the little alveoli, and again, surrounding them, we have these blood capillaries. So it's at all of this particular region where you have this respiratory membrane, where you have the alveoli and the capillary membranes meeting. This is where we can pick up oxygen and have our red oxygenated blood, but we're also dropping off carbon dioxide. We've got those veins that are, dropping off carbon dioxide, picking up oxygen, and then heading back to the heart. Now a little bit more about the alveoli. They are surrounded by fine elastic fibers and some pulmonary capillaries. So there's also some elasticity to it, and they do have their own blood supply. There's alveolar pores that connect adjacent alveoli. If I can look back at some of the different pictures, you have little pores connecting one alveoli to the next alveoli. It's a good thing. It helps equalize air pressure throughout the entire lung, and it also provides some alternate air routes. If you ever have any damage to any of your alveoli, you can still get air into, some of the alveoli. Now there are alveolar macrophages. These are the big eaters that help keep your alveolar surfaces sterile, so that we don't have bacteria growing here. We don't want debris building up here, because we want to maximize our gas exchange. Now, kind of a gross thing, we have about 2 million dead macrophages an hour. 2 million dead ones are carried by cilia all the way up through the entire throat and then are swallowed. So that's a lot of dead cells that we're swallowing all the time, but it's a good thing because it's keeping our lungs clean. Now, some basic things about the lung. One, it occupies almost all of the thoracic cavity, except in the mediastinum part of it, where you find the heart and some blood vessels and the esophagus. We have costal surfaces that are near the ribs. We have an anterior, a lateral, and a posterior surface of the lungs. They're mostly composed of alveoli, mostly. We do, however, have some stroma to kind of balance it out, made of elastic connective tissue. It's what gives elasticity to our lungs, so they can keep, they can stretch and recoil. Our lungs weigh about a little over 2 pounds each, so they don't weigh a lot. Some other parts, on the lungs you have the hilum. It's a little indented region where you're going to have major blood vessels, bronchi, some lymphatic vessels and nerves all entering into the lungs. Your left lung is smaller than the right, just because you've got the heart sitting right there. The little notch that forms in the lung is called the cardiac notch. Again, it's where the heart is. There's only 2 lobes on the left side. It is smaller. The right lung has 3 lobes. When we start looking at the lungs, other than the fact you've got 3 lobes on one side, 2 lobes on the other, those lobes are then divided down into what are known as bronchopulmonary segments. On your right lung, which is bigger, like you have 10, always 10. On your left lung, which has 2 lobes, and I'm like, it can be somewhere between 8 and 10 bronchopulmonary segments. Now, each are separated by their own connective tissue, little wall, little septum. They each have their own artery, they each have their own vein, and they each receive air supply from a tertiary bronchus, one of those little 3 with a little degree symbol after it. What's nice about it? Because each has its own airway, each has its own blood supply. If one particular bronchopulmonary segment is diseased or has cancer, you can remove just that one without affecting anything else. It's also in these bronchopulmonary segments you find little lobules. They're the smallest subdivisions that are visible to the naked eye. They look like little hexagons, 6 sides, and they're about the size of a pencil top, all the way up to about the size of a penny. And so you can see some of these little lobules inside of the pulmonary segments. Now, the lobules are also, surrounded by connective tissues, and it's usually the connective tissue that you find around the lobules that if you are breathing in smoke or debris, if you live in the city and are just kind of breathing in dust and dirt all the time, it's usually the connective tissue around the lobules that's picking all of it up, and it makes your lungs appear kind of dirty looking. Just looking at it, I'm like, here you can actually see some of those little lobules, kind of pencil eraser size, that you can see all these little tiny divisions scattered around the lungs. Now I like this picture because it kind of shows these different bronchopulmonary segments and divisions. So you've got 2 different lungs. Here's a trachea divided into primary bronchi, secondary bronchi as we go into the 3 different lobes, versus 2 different lobes. And then from there it divides into tertiary bronchi. So each color is blood, or is like it's the bronchi that are going into its own little bronchopulmonary segment. And on the right lung, you always have 10, 3, 2, and 5. You're always going to have 10 bronchopulmonary segments. On the left lung, again, each color are the bronchi that are going to each bronchopulmonary segment. You can have somewhere between 8 and 10. This picture is showing 9, 4 on the one lobe, 5 on the other lobe. Now, blood supply. We're almost done. Blood supply to the actual lungs itself. There are 2 different types of blood supply going to the lung. You need to know the difference. One is pulmonary circulation. This we've talked about already when we talked about the heart itself. We're bringing, pulmonary arteries. That was that one artery that we can find in an adult that carries unoxygenated blood. So a pulmonary artery comes from the heart. It brings blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen. Now, Mike, so it goes into all the pulmonary capillaries to pick up all that oxygen. And then once we oxygenated the blood, all that oxygenated blood goes back to the heart through the pulmonary veins and goes into that left atrium. We've talked about this. This is all kind of more circulatory system, but related to the lungs, because that's where we're picking up our oxygen. We also have what are known as bronchial arteries. This means the lung tissue itself needs oxygenated blood. I'm like, so we actually have various arteries that are coming from the aorta, so we're part of the systemic circulation. I'm like, so we have little arteries coming from the aorta that go into the lungs at the hilum that are bringing oxygenated blood to the lungs. So, kind of 2 different things. This is bringing blood specifically to the lungs to just pick up oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide, whereas bronchial arteries are a systemic circulation that's bringing oxygenated blood to the lungs. So the lung tissue has its own oxygenated blood. And then we have the pleury. This is, the double-layered serosa, very thin. This is what we're going to find surrounding the lungs. It divides the thoracic cavity into two pleural components. Anything pleural has to do with lungs, and a mediastinum. We have our parietal pleura and we have our visceral pleura. The parietal pleura is found on the thoracic wall, on the top part of the diaphragm, anywhere around the heart, because that sits kind of right in the middle, and between the lungs. The visceral pleura, that's sitting right on top of the external surface. And then between them, we have pleural fluid that fills the pleural cavity. So space, in between the two pleura, the parietal and the visceral, is the pleural cavity with pleural fluid, pleura meaning lungs. Why we want fluid outside of the lung? It helps provide lubrication and reduces surface tension. And so we want, and I'm like, breathing to be as easy as possible. We constantly are expanding and shrinking back and forth. I'm like, if you have too much friction, and I'm like, it can actually cause too much heat and damage tissue. We'll get more into surface tension later, but it also helps reduce the collapsing of lungs if we've got more surface tension. It also assists in expansion and recoil. So the fact that anytime we expand our lungs, they're also going to recoil, and then we can keep doing it over and over again. This is just kind of showing if we cut right through the lungs, we've got attached to the lungs, you have the visceral pleural, attached to the outside, you have the parietal pleural, in between you've got the pleural cavity. You can sometimes get an inflammation of the fluid inside of here, an inflammation of the pleura. Sometimes that can lead or come from pneumonia. Problem with it, if you start having inflammation on any of the pleura or in, excess fluid, each breath is going to be painful. It's going to hinder breathing movements altogether, and you can run into other problems that have to do with breathing. That's where we're going to end. We're going to start picking up on, how the breathing all happens next time.